Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. He invited me home. Those words still echo in my mind, not because they were unusual, but because of the way he said them, quietly, almost uncertainly, as if he was afraid of what my answer might mean. I remember that evening so vividly that sometimes it feels like I never really left it behind. It had been one of those long, grey afternoons when the sky can't decide if it wants to rain or clear. I was sitting alone at a small cafe that overlooked the river. The air smelled like coffee and damp wood, and I was lost in my thoughts, watching the current drift slowly past the bridge. Then he walked in. Michael. That was his name. I hadn't seen him in nearly 20 years, not since we both left the small town where we'd grown up. Back then, we were just two restless souls who wanted to see the world, both chasing something we couldn't name. Time had changed us, of course, it always does, but there was still something familiar in his eyes, something that made my heart pause for just a moment. He noticed me before I could decide whether to say hello. There was that split second of recognition, the smile that begins slowly and turns genuine, like sunlight breaking through clouds. We talked for hours, long after our coffee had gone cold. It wasn't like meeting a stranger again, it was more like remembering a language I used to speak fluently. He told me about his life, the years he'd spent working overseas, the quiet return to the town he'd once promised to escape forever. He'd lost people, just as I had. We spoke about grief and time, about how both can be cruel and generous in equal measure. There was no awkwardness between us, just a soft awareness that we were both older now, both carrying invisible stories we didn't need to explain. When the cafe closed, he looked at me and said, "Would you like to come over? It's been so long, I'd like to show you something." His voice was gentle, cautious, as if he didn't want to push too hard. I hesitated for a second, not out of fear, but out of the weight of the moment. Something told me that whatever was waiting in that invitation wasn't casual. It was a bridge to something deeper, something that might stir the parts of me I'd carefully tucked away. His house was on the edge of town, near the old train tracks. The drive there was quiet, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Outside, the rain had finally started, soft and steady, brushing against the windshield in rhythmic patterns. I remember the smell of wet earth and pine trees when we stepped out of the car. The night was calm, almost too calm, the way it gets just before you realize you're about to remember something important. The house was modest, with warm lights glowing through the windows. Inside, everything was neatly arranged, books on the shelves, a guitar leaning against the wall, the faint scent of cedar and coffee lingering in the air. There was something deeply personal about it, the kind of space that tells you exactly who someone is without them needing to explain. We sat in his living room, and he made tea. The kind of small gesture that feels like an embrace when words aren't enough. He talked about how quiet life had become since he'd moved back. How sometimes, in that silence, memories grew louder. I understood exactly what he meant. At one point, he took out an old photo album. It was filled with faces I hadn't seen in years, our classmates, the dusty streets of our childhood, the summer fairs and small-town dances. There was one photo of us, sitting on a fence, both laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. I could almost hear the sound of that laughter again, carried faintly across the years. "I kept that one," he said softly. "It reminds me that we were happy once." There was a tenderness in his words that I hadn't expected. A vulnerability that made me see him differently, not as the boy I'd known, but as a man who had carried his own quiet battles. I felt something shift inside me, something that had been asleep for a long time. We talked until the clock struck midnight. The rain hadn't stopped. He offered to drive me home, but I told him I'd rather walk. It wasn't far, and somehow I needed the air. He smiled, the kind of smile that says more than words ever could, and handed me his old umbrella. "Then take this," he said. "You never did like getting wet." As I stepped outside, the rain felt colder than before, but I didn't mind. I walked slowly, the rhythm of the drops echoing in my chest. That night wasn't just about an invitation, it was about rediscovering a piece of myself I thought I'd lost. When I reached the bridge, I stopped for a moment, looking down at the reflection of the streetlights trembling on the water. I realized then that sometimes the past doesn't return to haunt us, it returns to remind us that we're still capable of feeling, of remembering, of forgiving ourselves for what we let slip away. That I still have that umbrella. It sits by my front door, worn and slightly bent from the wind. Every time I see it, I think of that quiet night, the scent of rain and cedar, and the look in his eyes when he said my name. He invited me home, and maybe, in some quiet way, I did the same. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sky was pale and still, a soft blue that carried the scent of rain from the night before. The umbrella leaned by the door, still dripping faintly, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it again. I stood there for a while, just looking at it, remembering his face, the quiet steadiness in his voice. It had been years since someone had looked at me that way, with kindness, not expectation. I made myself coffee and sat by the kitchen window, the one that looked out onto my small garden. The world outside seemed freshly washed, and everything smelled like new beginnings. Yet, deep inside, there was a strange restlessness I couldn't quite name. All day, I thought about him. About the way his house had felt warm but quiet, like it had stories tucked into its corners. I thought about his hands when he turned the pages of that photo album, how gently he'd traced the edges of our younger faces. There was something about it that stirred a kind of nostalgia I hadn't felt in years, not for the past itself, but for the simplicity that had once lived in it. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Michael. I hope you got home safely. I enjoyed last night more than I expected to. If you're free, would you like to take a walk tomorrow? There's a trail by the river I'd like to show you. I must have read the message 3 times before I replied. There was no hidden meaning in his words, no rush, no pressure, just a quiet invitation again. Still, I could feel that familiar mix of warmth and hesitation growing in my chest. I said yes. The following day, the sky was clear, but the wind carried a coolness that hinted at the start of autumn. I met him near the old bridge, the same one I'd paused on that night. He was already there, leaning against the railing, watching the water move slowly beneath it. When he turned and saw me, his smile reached all the way to his eyes. We walked along the river path, the sound of our footsteps blending with the hum of cicadas. The sunlight danced through the trees, casting shifting patterns across the ground. Every now and then, he would stop and point out something small, a bird perched on a branch, a ripple in the water, a smooth stone that looked like it had been shaped by time itself. There was something deeply grounding about being near him. We didn't talk constantly, we didn't need to. There were pauses between our words that felt peaceful rather than awkward. It was as if silence itself had become another language we both understood. Eventually, we reached a small clearing that overlooked the river bend. He spread his jacket on the grass and sat down, motioning for me to join him. The wind carried the smell of pine and water, and the world seemed to slow around us. He told me about the years he'd spent alone after his father passed away. How he'd moved back into the family house to take care of it, only to realize that it wasn't just the house that needed care, it was him. It's strange, he said, staring out at the water, how time teaches you to live with quiet. It can heal you or swallow you whole, depending on how you face it. I nodded, because I knew exactly what he meant. After my divorce, I'd lived with that same silence. Some days it felt peaceful, and others, it pressed down on me like a weight. I told him that. And in that moment, we weren't 2 people telling stories, we were simply 2 lives quietly acknowledging each other's scars. When the sun began to set, the light turned golden and soft. He stood up, looked down at me, and said, almost as if he were asking permission, "Would you come over again? I made something I think you'd like to see." There was no hesitation this time. I nodded. Back at his house, the lamps glowed warmly again, the way they had that first night. On the table sat a small wooden box. He opened it and took out a small carving, a bird in mid-flight, its wings curved delicately. "I made it a few months ago," he said. "I didn't think it was finished until last night. I kept thinking about how you used to draw them by the lake when we were kids." I traced my finger along the smooth wood, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. It wasn't about the carving itself, it was about the care, the quiet remembrance of something so small that even I had forgotten it. It felt like being seen, truly seen, in a way that words could never capture. We sat there for hours again, talking about everything and nothing. The way life surprises you, the way people leave and return, the way time softens what once hurt. There was no rush, no expectation, only that gentle understanding that some connections aren't accidental. They're the result of years, choices, and maybe even grace. When I left that night, I felt lighter. The world outside was the same, but I wasn't. It was as if I'd opened a window inside myself that had been closed for far too long. As I walked home, the moon followed me across the sky, silver and calm. The air was cool against my face, and I remember thinking that maybe the universe has its own way of reuniting people, not to repeat the past, but to remind them that healing can arrive in the most unexpected invitations. That night, before I went to bed, I placed the small carved bird on my nightstand. I don't know if it meant as much to him as it did to me, but every time I look at it, I feel that same quiet warmth. He had invited me home again, and this time, I realized I wanted to stay a little longer, not in his house necessarily, but in the feeling he brought with him. It had been almost a week since that second visit, but Michael and I had fallen into a quiet rhythm of seeing each other. Sometimes he'd stop by the cafe where we first met, bringing 2 cups of coffee and a newspaper, as if we were old friends simply keeping up with the world. Other times, we'd take short walks through town, saying little, yet understanding everything that didn't need to be said. It's a strange thing, how life can begin to open again, just when you've stopped expecting it to. I had spent years keeping my heart steady, not necessarily closed, but cautious. People had come and gone. Some left softly, others with storms. I had learned how to build peace around solitude. But Michael had this quiet way of existing that didn't disturb my calm. He simply became a part of it. One evening, he called and asked if I'd join him for dinner. He said he wanted to cook for me, which made me laugh at first because I remembered how he used to burn toast in high school. "I've improved," he said, with that easy, half-teasing tone of his. When I arrived, the air was already filled with the scent of something warm and familiar: rosemary, garlic, maybe a touch of lemon. The table was set simply, with 2 plates, a bottle of wine, and a single candle flickering in the middle. It wasn't romantic in the dramatic sense, it was something gentler, more human. The kind of moment that tells you someone took time to care. We ate slowly, talking about everything from music to the strange way the world had changed. He told me he'd started carving again, not just birds but other things too: faces, landscapes, hands. "It helps me listen to silence," he said, almost shyly. I told him how I'd started painting again, just small things, mostly for myself. He smiled and said, "I'm glad you did. You always saw beauty in things the rest of us ignored." After dinner, he played the guitar for a while. The melody was soft, unpolished, but sincere. It filled the room like a memory you didn't realize you missed until it returned. I sat by the window, watching the reflection of the candle flicker across the glass, and for a long while, I didn't want to move. Then, without really planning it, we began talking about what had happened in the years between us: the marriages, the losses, the disappointments, the quiet victories no one else noticed. He told me about his mother's illness, how caring for her had changed him. I told him about the loneliness that came after my divorce, about how silence used to frighten me but had eventually become my companion. There were pauses in our conversation, soft, heavy moments where words didn't feel necessary. The kind of silence that doesn't separate people, but binds them closer. When it started to rain again, we stood outside on his porch. The night smelled like wet earth and wood smoke from a nearby chimney. The rain made everything shimmer under the streetlights. I remember standing there beside him, listening to the rhythm of the drops hitting the roof. He didn't reach for my hand, and I didn't expect him to. Somehow, the nearness itself was enough. He turned to me and said quietly, "You know, I never thought I'd feel comfortable again in someone's presence. For years, I thought I'd forgotten how." I looked at him, and for a moment I saw not just the man standing beside me, but the boy I'd once known, the one who used to dream of leaving town, chasing everything life had to offer. Time had softened him, but not in a way that dulled him, more like it had given him weight, substance. "I think comfort doesn't disappear," I said. "It just waits for the right person to remind us what it feels like." He smiled then, small, grateful, real. The rain began to fall harder, and he laughed softly, saying, "You should go before it gets worse." I nodded but didn't move right away. I wanted to hold on to that moment just a little longer: the sound of rain, the glow from his porch light, the quiet steadiness of his presence. When I finally turned to leave, he handed me a small wooden keychain shaped like a leaf. "Made this yesterday," he said. "Thought you might like it." It was such a simple gesture, but it carried something deep, a reminder that connection doesn't always need grand gestures. Sometimes, it's the quiet offerings that stay with us the longest. That night, as I walked home through the rain, I felt a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude for having found something genuine again, fear for how fragile it felt. It's strange, isn't it? How even peace can make you nervous, because you start to realize how much you've missed. It at a tea home. I placed the wooden leaf beside the carved bird on my nightstand. They looked small together, but somehow complete. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain, and realized that I wasn't just remembering him anymore. I was beginning to imagine a future again, something I hadn't done in years. That night, before I turned out the light, I whispered to myself a truth I'd forgotten. Sometimes, life doesn't give second chances, it gives quiet invitations, and it's up to us to answer them. The morning after that rainstorm, I woke to sunlight streaming through my curtains. It felt like the first truly clear day in weeks. The air smelled clean, and somewhere outside, a bird was singing, a sound that made me smile without meaning to. I poured myself a cup of coffee and glanced at my nightstand. The little wooden bird and the leaf keychain sat there side by side, catching the light. It struck me then how something so small could carry so much meaning. I decided to visit Michael that afternoon, not because we had planned it, but because it simply felt right. When I arrived, I found him sitting on his porch, reading a worn-out book and sipping tea. The way he looked up and smiled when he saw me, calm, surprised, quietly happy, made the world slow down again. "I was just thinking about calling you," he said. "I guess I saved you the trouble," I replied, and we both laughed softly. That day turned into one of those quiet, memorable afternoons that you never plan but somehow never forget. We walked through the garden behind his house, where the grass was still wet from the night before. He had planted rows of herbs, mint, sage, thyme, and they filled the air with their fresh, earthy scent. It felt peaceful there, as though time had learned to move slower between those green walls. We sat under an old maple tree, and he brought out a box filled with his carvings. Each one seemed to tell a small story: a woman's face with closed eyes, a pair of hands folded together, a child holding a lantern. There was a quiet honesty in each piece, a tenderness that spoke more about him than any words could. He handed me one shaped like a small open door. "It's not finished yet," he said. "I thought maybe I'd leave it that way. Some doors aren't meant to be closed." I turned it over in my hands, feeling the texture of the wood beneath my fingers. "I think that's what life is," I said. "A series of unfinished doors." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes thoughtful, and then he nodded. "Maybe that's true. Maybe we're all just walking through one after another, trying to make sense of where we've been." The afternoon sun grew softer as we talked about the past, our younger selves, the things we'd both once wanted, the roads that led us back to this quiet place. He told me he used to wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed in touch all those years ago. I told him that maybe we weren't ready then, that sometimes it takes a lifetime to meet someone in the right way. There was no tension in the silence that followed, only peace. The kind that comes when you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be. As the sun began to set, I helped him tidy up the porch. He looked at me and said softly, "I'm glad you came that night. I don't think you realize what it did for me." "What do you mean?" I asked. He smiled, almost shyly. I'd been living quietly, almost too quietly. That night reminded me that life isn't done with us yet. That there are still people who can walk into your story and make it lighter. I felt something warm rise in my chest, something that wasn't quite sadness but wasn't joy either, just an understanding that sometimes, the most meaningful moments aren't loud. They're gentle, patient, and they change you quietly. The next few weeks passed in an easy rhythm. We didn't see each other every day, but when we did, it always felt natural, like time paused just for us. Some evenings, we'd sit outside, saying little, listening to the wind move through the trees. Sometimes he'd play his guitar, and I'd hum along. It wasn't about filling the silence, it was about sharing it. One evening, he showed me something he'd been working on. It was a small sculpture, a pair of intertwined branches forming a heart-shaped frame. Inside, he had carved two tiny figures standing side by side, looking out toward an open horizon. "I don't know if it's done yet," he said. "But it feels like it's where it needs to be." I didn't say anything for a moment. My throat felt tight, but in the best way. "Finally," I said, "it's beautiful, Michael. It really is." He looked at me with that same quiet warmth, the kind that needs no explanation. I made it because. I think that's what this has been, he said softly. Two people, standing side by side, just looking ahead. That night, when I walked home, the world felt different, not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because everything ordinary suddenly felt precious. The lights from the houses, the smell of rain in the distance, the coolness of the air, all of it felt like part of a story still being written. When I reached my door, I paused and turned to look at the sky. The stars were faint but steady. I thought about how easy it is to forget that connection doesn't have to be loud or dramatic to matter. Sometimes, it's a conversation over tea, a shared silence, or the comfort of knowing someone is happy just to see you walk through their door. It's been months since that first evening, the night he invited me home. Life has continued, quietly but fully. We still meet often, sometimes at his house, sometimes at mine. We don't talk about what the future holds, and maybe we don't need to. Some stories aren't meant to end with grand declarations, they end with peace. Now, when I look at that little wooden bird and the leaf keychain on my nightstand, I see more than gifts. I see reminders that healing doesn't always come in the form of change. Sometimes, it comes in the form of rediscovery. He invited me home, but what I didn't realize then was that he was also inviting me back to myself, to the part of me that still believes in quiet beginnings and gentle miracles. And for that, I will always be grateful.